The Quarterly, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Lesson 12, Deuteronomy 24, A Just Society. The heart of the book of Deuteronomy is a lengthy delivery of the law, the detailed stipulations of the great king that bind the behavior and attitudes of the vassals in their covenant relationship. Deuteronomy 4:44. We've already seen aspects of that covenantal instruction in Deuteronomy 6 and 18. In Deuteronomy 24, Moses presents a variety of laws on different topics that may seem bewildering in their scope and reach. They might seem to be the essence of legalistic religion, in contrast to the grace and freedom of Christianity. But to think that would be a mistake. The book of Deuteronomy is meant to be a blessing to its readers, both then and now. God's law is holy and good, as Paul reminds us in Romans 7:12. It's not responsible for our sin, even if our rebellious hearts naturally run in the opposite direction from its wise guidance. The focus of this chapter is on protecting the weak and vulnerable against abuse. Ancient Near Eastern treaty documents typically had a section filled with stipulations for the vassal to keep, and these regulations served a twofold purpose. First, they demonstrated the wisdom of the great king, whose laws were just and upright, protecting the weak and disadvantaged from oppression by the strong. It's always the poor, the weak, the powerless who suffer in lawless societies, while the privileged use their power to get whatever they want. Second, these ancient law codes provided an opportunity for the vassal to demonstrate his loyal submission to his overlord. It's one thing to say to your master, "I am your humble servant," but until that declaration is matched by appropriate actions, it remains nothing more than words. The law code of the Mosaic covenant, vast though it seems to us, is far from comprehensive. Unlike modern law codes, which try to stipulate every detail for the judge to follow, ancient codes counted on the judge being a man of wisdom, who would be able to translate principles from one situation into another. So it is with the Old Testament teaching on divorce. There's no verse that says, "Thou shalt not divorce thy spouse," even though it's clear from Genesis 2:24 that marriage was intended to be an unbreakable covenant, and God condemns those who divorce their wives for flimsy reasons in Malachi 2:14-16. Here in Deuteronomy 24, the focus is on protecting wives from specific kinds of abuse. To begin with, it disallows instantaneous divorce. Unlike some cultures, where a man could divorce his wife simply by saying 3 times, "I divorce you," the man had to write a certificate of divorce and put it in her hands. Deuteronomy 24:1. Now, in a culture where many people would not have been able to read and write, and where writing was far from an everyday activity, this would have required significant thought and preparation before the divorce was effected. A man couldn't simply send his wife away in a fit of anger. The focus of the legislation here, however, is on the impossibility of a divorced wife being reacquired after she'd been remarried to someone else who then either divorced her or died. Verse 3. Now this may seem like a remarkably specific provision, and indeed it is, but its goal is to underline the permanency of the step of divorce. It could not lightly be undone, with a woman being passed around from one husband to the next and back again as if she were just a toy. The last part of this section protects a newly married wife, verse 5. She's especially vulnerable because she has not yet had a chance to bear children who could protect her in her old age. As a result, newly married young men are exempt from military service and other forms of obligated labor for the first year, in order for them to remain home and hopefully provide children for their wife. The next set of laws have to do with protecting human life in general. In a subsistence economy, The poor were only ever one step away from needing a temporary loan to survive, and often lenders would require security. The law limited what items could be asked for as collateral. A millstone cannot be taken in pledge, because that would leave the poor man and his family unable to grind grain for their daily food. Verse 6. The lender was also not to enter the debtor's house to get the pledge. He was to allow the man to retain his dignity by remaining outside while he went in to fetch it. Verses 10 to 11. And if a lender took the cloak of a poor man in pledge, he was not to keep it overnight. The ESV's "you shall not sleep in his pledge" suggests that the lender was using the poor man's cloak himself, which seems rather unlikely. It would be better to translate it, "you shall not sleep with his pledge." The lender was to return the pledge to the man overnight, so that he had something to keep him warm until morning. Verse 13. Now this kindness would result in the poor man blessing the lender for his righteous behavior before the Lord. The debtor is, after all, your neighbor, verse 10, and therefore someone to be treated with love, just as we ourselves would want to be treated. Leviticus 19:18. Interspersed among the regulation of debts are other laws by which Israel could demonstrate their concern to obey the Lord. The first prohibits stealing a fellow Israelite and selling him into slavery. Exodus 21:16 shows that the same law actually applied to non-Israelites as well. That practice of forcibly enslaving people was to be treated as a capital offense, so that the evil might be purged from their midst. Deuteronomy 24, verse 7. Now, certain forms of debt slavery were permitted in Israel, whereby a man might sell himself into indentured service for a period of time to repay a debt. Exodus 21:2. But the servant was to be well treated, and sent away with generous wages at the end of the period of his service. Deuteronomy 15:14. This provided a safety net for the poorest of the poor. Israel was also required to treat the priestly laws on leprosy seriously. Deuteronomy 24:8. These laws can be found in Leviticus 13 and 14. They were to follow all the directions of the Levitical priests in the matter, carefully separating the lepers from the community as an emblem of the necessary separation from the equally contagious plague of sin. No favoritism was to be shown to anyone. All were to be treated alike. After all, even Miriam had to stay outside the camp for 7 days when she was struck with leprosy as a divine judgment for grumbling against Moses. Numbers 12:10 through 15. The remainder of the chapter groups together laws designed to protect the poor and the needy in the community, whether native-born Israelite or foreign sojourner. The poorest people typically had no land, and were often dependent upon day labor to support themselves. Since they lived hand to mouth, it was vital that they were paid daily, so they could buy food for themselves and their families. Just as treating a poor man who owed a debt kindly would lead to him blessing you, so too abusing a poor man would make him call down a deserved curse upon you. Deuteronomy 24:15. Likewise, justice should be equal for all, whatever their rank, ethnicity, or financial standing. The sojourner and the fatherless were particularly vulnerable, since they had no one who was well connected to argue their case when it came to court in front of the elders of the community. Verse 17. But the elders should remember that they had all once been sojourners in Egypt, and thus be careful to do justice equally across all social and ethnic classes. This care for the poor was to extend further than simple justice. Rather, Israel was to be marked out by an uncommon grace that enabled the poor to support themselves with dignity through work. It was generally accepted that the poor might come through a field after the harvesters were finished to pick up whatever scraps remained. This law goes much further than that, however, in putting the onus on the landowner to make the difficult task of the gleaner much more profitable by deliberately not harvesting the maximum amount possible, verses 19 to 21. Rather, the harvesters were to leave significantly more than there was absolutely necessary in the fields, to ease the lot of widows, fatherless, and sojourners, remembering that they were once themselves sojourners in Egypt, verse 22. These laws are given to Israel in the specific context of their life in the Promised Land, and are therefore civil law rather than moral law or ceremonial law. That means they don't directly govern Christian divorce law, nor do they restrict the practices of modern farmers. Nonetheless, they do still guide Christians with regard to their general equity, the principles of divine wisdom that underlie them, even though that application may look rather different in a modern society. Application questions. What does this passage contribute to a Christian view of divorce and remarriage? 2. What can we learn from Deuteronomy 24 about debtors and loans? 3. How do we protect and help the poor and the powerless in our community? 4. How does this blueprint for a just society connect with the gospel?